and today's session really is designed to immerse you all and into Nigerian modernism, the exhibition by Tate Modern that has been supported and powered by Access Holdings and Coronation Group. In the session today, we're going to go over, we'll receive an opening message from our chairman. We're also going to look at a curated exhibition segment, a segment that explores the exhibition itself. We get to see the artworks that are featured in the exhibition, and there's also going to be a live conversation that will be led by the Senior Curator of International Arts, African and Diaspora at Tate Modern. His name is Osei Bonsu, and this session will be moderated by Daniel Wallace, who is an art educator and expert at Tate. And now, let's listen to a message from our chairman, Igboje Ig Imugode.
For me, this is much more than an exhibition. It's a cultural celebration that puts Nigerian art and artists and our creatives in their rightful place at the heart of global modernism. I grew up personally surrounded by Nigerian art. More than 50% of the artists whose work you see today
Apologies, everyone. There seems to be a technical glitch with the video. We'll reshare this and play the video again. But if you're just joining us, I'd like to once again welcome you to the World Art Day session inside Nigerian Modernism, powered by Access Holdings and Coronation Group. My name is Naftali Adala. I'm the Marketing and Communications Analyst at Coronation. Once again, we'll share the video now and then we can take the message. Thank you.
For me, this is much more than an exhibition. It's a cultural celebration that puts Nigerian art and artists and our creatives in their rightful place at the heart of global modernism. I grew up personally surrounded by Nigerian art. More than 50% of the artists whose work you see today, including those who are not here with us, were uncles or aunties to me. Inspired by my parents' passion for culture, those early experiences certainly inspired and conditioned and shaped my worldview and made me very proud of my cultural identity. I believe that a nation's true wealth comes from three sources of capital: financial capital, knowledge capital, and cultural capital. When you drive these three sources of wealth together, they lead to an exponential amplification of a nation's global influence, enabling that nation's citizens to contribute meaningfully to development and advancement. Nigeria has more than 220 million people, 300 ethnic groups and counting, and even more languages. We are blessed, truly blessed, with cultural capital. Our visual and performing arts, our food, our fashion, and our all-over creativity is a major factor behind the African rising narrative.
All right, thank you all. That was a message from our chairman, Ipj Ike Imokwede. And just as he has said, the place of cultural capital can never be understated. The message, clearly captures the intention behind this partnership. And for us, it's not just to support art, but really to also help shape how African stories can be seen and are actually understood globally. Now, to help us build on that context, I'll now invite the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer, Ngozi Akinyele, to deliver the opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Naftali, and happy World Art Day. I don't think I heard you say that so well. It's World Art Day, so I would say happy World Art Day to everyone. On behalf of the leadership of Access Holdings and Coronation Group, I warmly welcome everyone who has joined early to this very special conversation with our partners at Tate, one of the world's leading institutions, cultural institutions that is dedicated to preserving, studying, and sharing art with global audiences. It's World Art Day. For a couple of years now, we have commemorated World Art Day with several engagements. And I think that this is the most significant, so far, given that we have an opportunity to celebrate something that expresses the spirit of collaboration and partnership. On days like this, we are invited to pause and reflect on deeper ideals, our culture, identity, our freedoms that is expressed, ideals that are expressed through the work of artists who interprets the spirit and the struggles of their time and give them an enduring form. At the core, at Access, Coronation, and Tate, I believe we share this common conviction that access to art should be democratized. Access to art should be for all and not a select few. And I believe just earlier in the chairman's remarks, he beautifully captured it at the opening of the Nigerian Modernism exhibition, which we're going to be talking about today, and I'll leave it to the experts to go into more detail. But when he said that the true wealth of a people lies in three forms of capital, in financial capital, cultural capital, and knowledge or intellectual capital, that resonated really strongly with us because as institutions, as financial institutions, we are stewards or custodians of financial capital. Every single day, with the work we do, we basically drive access to finance. But on moments like this, we are reminded that cultural capital is equally vital. One builds prosperity and another gives prosperity meaning. One strengthens institutions and another shapes identity and also inspires or sparks dialogue, which is exactly what we hope that this session would encourage, that it would spark curiosity, it will spark reflection and conversation, which will be reflected in the questions, the comments that we hope to see in the comments and the Q&A section of this chat. We are honored, to have the curator of the Nigerian Modernism exhibition, which has been critically acclaimed, a significant body of work, who has and has been, stewarded, birthed, through Tate. And I really hope above all today that as you listen, as you watch the virtual tour, which would come up now, as you engage in the Q&A after, that you would truly understand what we have achieved or what we are achieving together. You will be informed, you'll be inspired, and have a true sense of pride. What can happen when we come together to drive access to art for all. So welcome again, and I'll turn it over now to the multimedia section, where we would go through a virtual tour of the Nigerian Modernism exhibition. Thank you again for joining early.
Hi, my name is Osei Bonsu, Senior Curator International Art at Tate Modern.
Hi, I'm Bilal Akush, Assistant Curator of International Art at Tate Modern.
And we're co-curators of Nigerian Modernism. So Nigerian modernism traces the development of modern art in Nigeria throughout the 20th century, focusing on the artists who really pioneered the development of modern art, who've created art schools, clubs, societies, groups that have all in different ways contributed towards the transformation of art in Nigeria. So the first room of the exhibition is titled Figuring Modernity, and it kind of deals with the importance of figuration and the figure in relation to what it means for artists to intervene within this idea of what modernism is. Modernism is more often associated with development of art in Europe, but in fact there were many artists in Nigeria who were pioneering figures in changing the way that we think about modern art, and I think with that we'll focus on some examples in this room that are really outstanding. So maybe the first example we can look at is this image of Charlotte Obesa, titled Sisi Nurse. It's a work by Aina Onabolu, one of the first Nigerian artists to really transform, you could say, arts education in Nigeria, and he insisted on this idea of academic portraiture as a kind of means to modernize art in Nigeria. And he believed that through the acquisition of kind of the skills associated with easel painting, Nigerian artists could actually be in dialogue with their European counterparts. So he trained at St. John's Wood College here in London, but also in Paris, and actually acquired some extraordinary skills that he then used to encourage other artists. And I think what's important is that these are portraits of Nigerians commissioned by Nigerians, and I think some of the first of their kind. I don't know whether, Bilal, you want to add anything?
I can take you over to the next artist that we can spotlight, who is Akinola Lashikan, who was trained under Aina Onabolu and utilized some of the similar techniques, but really focused on sort of Yoruba folktales. So here you can see a series of paintings that speak to these indigenous traditions, utilizing the same sort of techniques.
And these span about a 50-year period. So he was an artist that was extremely prolific in his time, and actually he was in dialogue with other forms of art being made at the time. So whether it was figural wooden sculptures being made by figures like Justice Akorodelu, or the great Yoruba carving traditions associated with the Oluwe of Ise. This is a carved door from 1910 that records an encounter between a British colonial officer and a Nigerian king. There is a kind of extraordinary breadth of vision in this room that speaks to the multi-directional nature of Nigerian art in the early 20th century. So we're now going to move to the next room focused on the artist Ben Nwonwu. So this is a room dedicated to the pioneering African artist Ben Nwonwu. He was an artist born in Onitsha in 1917, and in fact, because his career sort of straddled the colonial and post-colonial period, he's somewhat of a complex and contradictory figure within the emergence of modern Nigerian art. He was an artist who became associated with many elite circles here in the UK, where he was commissioned to create the famous portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, which is also featured through a large exhibition graphic in the back there. But I think more significantly, he was an artist who was constantly grappling with what it meant to have received a classical European arts education as a student at the Slade College of Art, while embracing his indigenous traditions and traditions associated with Onitsha Masquerade, the town that he grew up in. And what's fascinating is through his depiction of both female and male Igbo masquerades, he was able to really inspire these ideas of negritude and Pan-Africanism that were kind of widespread in the 1940s and became very much closely associated with historical figures like Leopold Sedar Senghor, who founded the concept of negritude. So as we move down this room, we see an extraordinary array of images that kind of speak to his interest in cultural festivals, that speak to the kind of cross-religious and multi-ethnic character of Nigerian life. And these are made across a 50-year span. I don't know whether, Bilal, you want to point out any highlights that speak to you.
Yeah, a personal favorite of mine is the Durbar Avid festival that he made in 1955. And here you can really see a site of celebration. Yeah. We'd also love to spotlight the the Daily Mirror sculptures that were loaned from Access Bank.
Yeah, absolutely.
And these are a highlight of the exhibition and a centerpiece. And we're really excited to be including them.
And these are really modern masterpieces. I mean, they were initially created as a commission for the famed UK newspaper, the Daily Mirror, to kind of decorate their offices in part, but they've become these kind of iconic symbols of the acquisition of knowledge, ideas associated with power and transcendence. And actually, if you look carefully at these men who all appear to be reading newspapers, they almost look like angels kind of ascending. And I think there's something very evocative about the way in which Inwan will use sculpture to embed himself within Igbo traditions, within traditions associated with his father, and the use of the adze, which is an indigenous carving tool, but constantly synthesizing different forms and techniques. And I think as a figure that emerged actually on the eve of independence, he became, I think, associated with everything that artists could achieve, but actually he was somewhat of an exception. He was one of the few artists that actually managed to build an international career, becoming one of the premier African modernists. You could say at a time where artists were still struggling under colonial rule to define their own visions. And I think Nwanwu, for that reason, is celebrated within this exhibition through a vast array of works, but certainly is just one among many important Nigerian artists that we wanted to spotlight. We're now going to move on to the next room, focused on the ceramicist Ladi Kwali. So as you'll see as you enter this room, it's a very focused spotlight on an outstanding figure within the development of modern Nigerian art, Ladi Kwali, who was trained as a ceramicist at the PTC, the Pottery Training Center in Abuja. And actually the color that we've used for this particular room is associated with the color of sort of traditional terracotta pots. And through this process of kind of high-fired ceramic techniques, Ladi Kwali was able to synthesize the European techniques imported by the Pottery Training Center and the traditional Gwari techniques that were pioneered by women over generations. So she's known for her ceramics, most of which are water pots, casserole dishes, beer mugs, in which she incisors sort of spiritual emblems or signs that have to do with traditional Gwari knowledge systems. So you can see the lizard, you see various kind of bugs, and the idea is ultimately that Ladi Kwali was more than just a ceramicist. She was an artist that was developing her own original take on ceramics that I think transcended this idea of utilitarian objects. And it's known, in fact, that some of her ceramics were so large in scale that they actually kind of they were more of an expression of her own personal artistic endeavor than they were utilitarian objects. So when we often think about ceramics, we think about it in relation to a very gendered idea of art. And it's important within this exhibition that we spotlight that we spotlit a woman artist who's engaged in a very important cultural endeavor that should be recognized in the same light as painting and sculpture, and that ceramics are no different. They reflect a real sense of artistic ambition and integrity. I don't know whether you want to say anything else about that.
No, just to say that we really wanted to spotlight her as a woman artist, that has become a household name.
Absolutely.
And just showcase her alongside painting, sculpture, and take her out of this idea of domesticity
Yeah.
and utilitarian objects and really present her as a fine artist
Absolutely.
amongst her peers.
Yeah, and some of the material in this vitrine, for example, spotlights some of the demonstrations that she led at historically black colleges throughout the US, where she was effectively showing Gwari techniques to, an African diasporic audience. So Ladi Kwali's kind of sort of example transcended Nigeria. She was in fact perceived as a national figure, but also a figure that had that represented, I think, a kind of an important example of what women in Nigeria were doing at the time. And I think we can't understate the significance of her work within this exhibition. So this room is probably one of the most dynamic and multifaceted in the exhibition, and it's a room that's really dedicated to the kind of elaboration of artistic forms that emerged during the period of independence. The title of this room is actually New Art, New Nation, and that comes from a manifesto written by the artist Uche Okeke, who declared that Nigeria needed a new art for a new nation, and that it was important that young Nigerians take on this challenge of crafting a new kind of art. An art that was at once celebratory of indigenous cultures, but also cognizant of many of the European traditions that had been imported through the education system. What's fascinating about the Zaria Art Society is that they formed as a student society in the first instance, but they became some of the leading figures anywhere in the nation. So many of them spread out after graduating from NCAS, the Nigerian College of Art, Science and Technology, to teach in various parts of Nigeria. And their legacy is as important in from a pedagogical standpoint as it is from an artistic one, that these were really educators, the first of which is Clara Ogbadagangu, who actually trained at Chelsea College of Art here in London and then went back to Nigeria to teach, and was actually not only the first female teacher, but the only Nigerian teaching at the Nigerian College of Art, Science and Technology. And she ended up inspiring many male artists who would go on to receive more critical visibility and success. But it was so important that we open with works by Clara Badaga. And then there are many other examples across this wall that speak to the kind of various sort of expressions that were emerging during this period, where artists were embracing Pan-African ideas, they were embracing ideas of a multi-religious, multi-ethnic society. And I think this particular work that Bilal can speak to kind of captures so much of this multi-ethnic and multi-religious aspect of Nigerian culture, where you have artists who may have been born into one religion, who are actually creating images that honor different forms of religious practice.
Yeah, so this is a favorite of ours, and it's made by Uche Okeke. It's called Juma from 1961, and it depicts a group of men leaving the mosque after Friday Juma prayer. And what's fascinating about this room specifically is that there are artists grappling with ideas around post-coloniality and this idea of a new nation, nationhood, belonging. But there are also the same artists are also depicting daily life, daily ritual, what it means to be a human, and things like that. Another favorite of ours is Fulani Horseman from Jimo Okolo, by Jimo Okolo. And Jimo Okolo is an amazing artist. In this work, he's depicting Fulani horsemen from the north of Nigeria, the Islamic majority area of Nigeria. This work was first shown in his 1964 Commonwealth Institute exhibition held in London. Yeah. And it could be the first time since then in an institutional capacity that it's been shown in London again. So we're really excited to show.
Yeah, and Commonwealth was one of those rare spaces in London where Black artists, Asian artists were given some of their first opportunities to present their work as an extension of the cultural diplomacy associated with the Commonwealth. But what's so key about Jimo Okolo is that he was a figure that refused to be associated with the Zaria Art Society, partly because he wanted to be seen as an individual artist. And that idea of independence extends well beyond the kind of political idea of national independence. It's also associated with artists who were grappling with what it meant to belong to a sense of nationhood, but also to a community. And I think Jimo Okolo is fascinating in the sense that he's one of those figures whose works are maybe more explicitly directed towards northern representations of Nigerian life, so Fulani and Hausa people, as is reflected in this image of Fulani horsemen who were known for being associated with the spread of Islam throughout northern Nigeria. So it's a real historic work that's captured in kind of bold, abstract form and kind of speaks to this idea of natural synthesis for which the Zaria Art Society was so celebrated. So we're now going to move to another room dedicated to the city of Lagos. So as you enter this room, you might hear the faint sound of high life music, which is a musical genre developed in the 1950s and 60s, very much led by artists who were synthesizing forms of traditional West African music together with music from Latin America and from Europe, but really music that was played at nightclubs throughout Lagos at the time. Many of these artists were directly impacted by high life music and were interested in high life as a model of kind of cultural hybridity. But also what's happening in parallel is you have the transformation of the Lagos skyline. So actually on this wall, we actually show a kind of vista of buildings from across Lagos that are associated with tropical modernism, which was a style of architecture very much born out of the synthesis of the conditions of the tropical climate of Nigeria and the modernist principles or the international style associated with many European modernist architectural schools at the time. And it's through this kind of synthesized, through these forms of synthesizing artistic languages that you really see Lagos transform during this period to become a real hub, not only for economic development, but as a space in which artists are almost coming together to create new forms of art, new forms of cultural expression. And I would say that the sculptures in this room are very fascinating. They're by artists who are mostly based in Lagos during this time, not necessarily associated with major art schools, but who were trained primarily through Nigeria's Royal Sculpture Guilds. So you have figures like Ahama Omokpai, Beno Sawi, Okpu Eze, all of whom were kind of thinking about how to assimilate a kind of international modernist style, very much in response to global trends and global conversations, and who were really kind of leading the charge in terms of bringing contemporary Nigerian art to a kind of widespread audience. Many of them received commissions to create murals and create sculptural reliefs for public buildings all over Lagos, some of which still exist to this day.
Yeah, you can see an Omokpai mural here.
Exactly. This is an extraordinary example. And this actually still stands today. This is a relief created by the artist and sculptor Felix Idabo, which sits at the base of Independence House, that was commissioned to inaugurate the independence celebrations in 1960. So there are many important narratives being carried through this particular part of the exhibition. And I think we're now going to move through to a section dedicated to the Oshogbo School. Brings together a selection of artists associated with the Oshogbo School, which was a school that emerged again in the 1960s in parallel with what was happening at the Zaria, within the Zaria Art Society and at NCAST, but more specifically associated with artists who had not received formal academic training. So many of these artists were individuals who were very much invested in Yoruba culture and in Yoruba spirituality, and had actually come to art through the insistence of Duro Ladipo, an extraordinary Nigerian dramatist and performer who had encouraged artists to take up theatre and drama as a way of expressing deeply held belief systems of Yoruba religion. And I think what's significant about Duro Ladipo and his kind of network is that they were transdisciplinary. They were artists working across theatre, textile, poetry, sort of forms of printmaking. And I think this is all captured within this room titled Festival of the Gods. It's titled Festival of the Gods because to this very day in Oshogbo, you have many important cultural and religious festivals, including the Ogungun Festival, the Festival of Oshun, that remain very important sites of spiritual pilgrimage for the Yoruba people. And I think there are so many examples that we could point to in this particular room, but I would like to focus specifically on this work by Mama Nike Davis, as she's lovingly known. Mama Nike is an artist who's probably best known for her pioneering use of Adire textiles and batiks. And these are traditions associated with the Yoruba culture. But by the time that Mama Nike had began working in the 1960s, she was interested in using textiles as a way to provide opportunities for social mobility, particularly for women. And she was fascinated in this idea that through textile, women could tell their own stories, but they could also gain access to new opportunities, new financial opportunities. And she set up a center specifically to support that endeavor. And in this particular image, we see the powerful symbol of the goddess Oshun that kind of sits at the center of this room as a powerful spiritual figure. And the goddess of Oshun is, of course, known to many people who live in Oshogbo as the kind of deity that to whom an important shrine is dedicated at the Oshun Oshogbo groves. And in and amongst these shrines that were revived in the 1960s by the New Sacred Art movement, you have this real spiritual power and this sense of spiritual calling that many of the artists in this exhibition are speaking to, but specifically in this room, it's about the kind of revival of Yoruba spiritual reliefs through visual art. And many of these stories would have been passed down through oral traditions, but seldom were they visualized. And I think what these artists did is they brought new visual form to many mythological and folkloric tales of Yoruba religion. And I think it's why they remain such a celebrated group of artists in Nigeria to this very day. I don't know whether there's anything you'd like to highlight from this particular room, Bilal.
Well, just to add that it was a beautiful coincidence that we positioned Jimo Baramo, Nike Davis Okunde, and Moriana Oliemi, because they were all here for the opening on this morning.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just wonderful to see them all together.
Absolutely.
And they were so happy and yeah, just over the moon with the representation of their work. And one thing we've really tried to do is represent artists in depth. So instead of one work per artist, we've tried to do at least 2 or 3 to showcase the breadth of their work. And yeah, we're really excited that they were able to make it.
Absolutely. And I would say that almost every artist in this room is speaking to a different narrative. One of the things that we're really excited about is this idea that it might encourage people who maybe have not themselves received a formal arts education, but are inspired by this idea that many of these artists were working, for instance, on hardboard. They were producing textiles, working with textiles sourced from the local market. And it's that kind of commitment to storytelling that I think separates the Oshogbo school from many of their counterparts, but also this real idea that in Nigeria during this period, and this of course is before the period of the Civil War, you had this cross-pollination of artistic influence. So Georgina Bayer, who is a British artist teaching at the Oshogbo school at the time, had influenced many of these artists, but also the African-American painter Jacob Lawrence, figures like Melangatana, the Mozambican painter, had all traveled to Oshogbo to lead workshops. And what you're seeing is the kind of result of all of that cultural cross-pollination and a real investment in sharing knowledge and sharing information. And I think that's what makes this particular room so resonant, is that it celebrates the various ways in which artists created community within this period.
I think we're also really excited to see what comes out of this presentation in terms of PhDs or further exhibitions, because there's so much research to be done. For example, we came across this wonderful work by Twin 77 called Condemning Witchcraft, Red Skulls, which is held at the Senate House Library, University of London. And yeah, just an amazing work, and there just needs to be so much more kind of research and yeah, into all of these artists and works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say that many of the Yoruba artists associated with the Oshogbo school were interested in extending personal mythologies, but they were also interested in the fiction of writers like Amos Tutuola, whose famous novel, The Palm Wine Drunkard, inspired many of the images you're seeing in this room. So lots of references to fantastical realism, and this kind of coalescence of the spiritual world and the world of the living was very much a feature of their work. And I think one of the reasons that the Oshogbo school is so unique is that they were not afraid to delve into folklore and into areas of Nigerian spiritual life that until that point had been challenged by the proliferation of Christianity, and specifically the kind of the ways in which you could say Nigeria had in some instances lost contact with these traditional forms of religious practice. We're now going to move to one of the final rooms in the exhibition dedicated to the Nsukka school. So as you enter this room, you'll hear the kind of voice, the reverberation of the voice of Christopher Okigbo, an extraordinary Nigerian poet who spent much of his career kind of contemplating the politics of nationhood and what it really meant for a writer, in his case, to kind of build a new form through poetry that would kind of embody, you could say, the possibilities of a new nation. Just before Christopher Okigbo died in the Nigerian Civil War, there was a very very strong sense that many of his works were almost viewed as a kind of prophesizing of what was to come. He was evoking the language of the natural world, of thunder, to kind of symbolize the death and destruction that he saw as kind of an inevitability of rising ethnic tension. The Nigerian Civil War was, of course, a period of huge loss, particularly for the Igbo community, and I think a period that many artists reflect upon with a great sense of pain and anguish. And I think what was important to honor in this part of the exhibition is this kind of balancing of artists who were, yes, addressing the political situation, but also emerging into this kind of period of national reunification during a time where there were many scars, you could say, on the kind of national landscape of Nigerian identity. And I think that in this particular work by Obiora Duchukwu, titled Our Journey, you see his commitment to Igbo uli mark making, which is a form of indigenous practice, traditionally practiced by women in Nigeria for centuries, and had actually been appropriated by male artists in the 1970s as a means of reviving an abstract tradition that was very much associated with Igbo identity. And I think this is just an extraordinary example of how abstraction within the context of Igbo belief systems was very much a part of a living culture. It wasn't necessarily associated with Western ideas of abstraction. It was about artists coming to this through the indigenous language of uli mark making. So uli murals are traditionally created by women, as I mentioned before, as a form of mural making, but also as a form of body art. And in fact, many of the symbols associated with these marks, like the crescent moon or the spiral, are represented across a variety of works in this very room. But I think Our Journey is probably the most powerful and symbolic example of an artist pushing the abstract qualities of uli mark making to the very limit.
And on the opposing wall, we have a depiction of the uli mark and symbols from the facade of a wall or a building. And these have been taken from the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, from the Northcote Whitridge Thomas collection. And like Jose said, it was really important to highlight the kind of women that were doing this at the turn of the century. These images were taken in 1911 and can be seen in dialogue with some of the artworks that are shown in this room. Absolutely.
And what's important to note is that when the campus of Nsukka reopened in the 1970s, many of these artists were still recovering from the traumas associated with the war, but it was under the influence of Uche Okeke, who is the main professor, the leader of the Nsukka Fine Art Department, that many of them began to revive uli tradition. So Uche Okeke created this painting, Anamwo, Land of the Dead, in 1961, so well before the Civil War, but it actually evokes the kind of Igbo spiritual world associated with the Land of the Dead. And actually many of these sorts of figures that you see hovering through the landscape are directly correlate to Igbo uli mark making. So there's a real sense that he embedded the idea of natural synthesis that he, of course, had developed as a student at the Zaria Art Society at NCAST, and elaborated it to introduce a new generation of artists and to encourage a new generation of artists to take up this new form of visual expression. And in the final wall in this room, you have a variety of artists who were really sort of inspired by the influence of Obiora Duchukwu, but also of Uche Okeke, who at a certain point was still teaching at the university. And they include figures like Ndidi Dike, Taiwo Adenaike, Oluwaguibe, and Ada Uduchukwu, all of whom you could say became the kind of second generation of artists to grapple with the abstract possibilities of uli mark making. So we're very proud and excited to be able to present an intergenerational perspective of Nigerian art, really looking at the kind of lines of influence, but also these kind of shared dialogues, these shared political, artistic, and cultural commitments that I think are writ large across the exhibition. So we're now going to move into the final room of the exhibition, Painting in Darkness, which focuses on the artist Uzo Ogonu. So this room is a room that we're especially proud of. We managed to assemble an extraordinary array of artists, of works by one of Nigeria's most celebrated and yet, I think, overlooked artists at the same time. Uzo Ogonu is a figure who spent the majority of his career in the UK. He actually arrived in the UK shortly after the end of the Second World War, during a time of national reconstruction and during a time in which many Black British artists were contemplating this question of what did it mean to ask questions about their role within British society. And he joined the Black Arts movement and became associated with figures like Ronald Moody, the famed Caribbean artist living in Britain. But he also constantly felt this sense of longing for home, this longing for return. And I think that one of the things that really characterizes his practice is this embrace of the abstract qualities of Uli murals and Uli mark making, but kind of combined with these more abstract and more postmodern principles. He's working well into the 1980s, and he's fundamentally, as with his counterparts based in other parts of Nigeria, sort of synthesizing these different artistic traditions. And we decided to pair these two paintings for a specific reason. The painting on the bottom is titled Woman in Grief, which reveals this kind of fragmented body in the aftermath of war. It was painted in 1968 as a kind of reflection on the trauma associated with the Nigerian Civil War. And then a painting that was painted within a year of that, which is an image of Piccadilly Circus in London. And these two realities, kind of these two spaces in which he was, the two environments that he was occupying, one in his imagination, because he of course didn't return to Nigeria until 1977, and the other, which was his everyday environment of probably catching the London bus into central London to go to Piccadilly Circus. So it's a real eye-opener in terms of how he was negotiating these various visual traditions. And I think one of the last series that we'd really like to focus on is Stateless People. It's made up of a large body of works, but we've brought together three very significant examples from this series that was first unveiled at the South Bank Centre in London towards the end of the 1980s. And I don't know whether you want to say a few words about this series, Bilal, because it was a really important series of works to bring together, but a series of works that I think we were almost amazed by just the originality of what he was doing, but also how pioneering he was for what he was trying to say with this particular body of work.
Definitely, and you can really see his strong use of color throughout the three paintings.
Absolutely.
And this idea that he's centering the individual. So
Yeah.
we've got an artist here with a beret, we've got the poet and the poetess, and it's really contemplating ideas around belonging and nationhood and centering the individual that make up these kind of ideas of nation and nation states and what have you. And yeah, we're really excited to have brought these three works together for the first time since the 1980s.
Absolutely. And what's significant to say is that at the time, Uzo Ogonu was grappling with his frustrations with the politics of nationhood. He was very critical about the political environment of Nigeria, but he also felt slightly resentful about the fact that he'd never been able to return, only for a short time during Festac Festival of 1977. So in the 1980s, at a point where he's losing his eyesight, he creates one of his most vibrant and kind of politically charged series, Stateless People, where he's asking a question that I think is as resonant today about this sense of statelessness. What does it mean for an artist to refuse kind of national identity and to kind of pursue an artistic endeavor, you could say, against the grain of how they may feel about their connection to a particular nation? And I would say Uzo Ogonu's expression of nationhood is rather unique within this exhibition, but it's one that I think speaks to an artist's right to pursue their own idea of independence. So when we talk about the development of independence in Nigeria, it's about political independence, but also about an artist's right to fashion their own independent visions of what Nigeria could be. And I think no artist has done that in a more bold and confrontational a way than Uzo Ogonu. And I think to end the exhibition with this work was a way of really synthesizing so much of what artists are speaking to, which is this kind of significant drive towards creating a new image, a new vision of the nation in the aftermath of colonialism, but more importantly, I think leading us into the 21st century. And of course, Uzo Ogonu is an artist who sadly passed away in the 1990s, creating a path for a global diaspora of artists to emerge. And I think he was one of the first Nigerian artists living in the UK to then gain recognition that would, as I mentioned before, create a path for others to follow in his wake. So we're very proud to bring these works together. Thank you for following this tour, and please come to see Nigerian Modernism at Tate. It runs through May of 2026, and we hope you enjoy the exhibition. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was simply amazing. I spent the entire 30 minutes feeling a very strong sense of pride, being a Nigerian and being an employee of our Coronation Group. And for me, I think it was very interesting to note that, throughout this session, one key thing I took was that art is very much a tool that's used to preserve culture and history, particularly when Osei referred to a section of the exhibition that highlighted Lagos. And that was particularly interesting for me because the images I saw didn't really look like the Lagos I know, that the Lagos that I live in. So it's very important to, um, find the significance in art and understand the role art actually plays in building and driving culture. I think that this was a truly beautiful exhibition, and that's why it's very important for organizations like Coronation Group and Access to power such initiatives because it contributes significantly to the broader narrative, of art and Nigeria and Africa's place in global conversations. Welcome again to those of you who are just joining. This is the World Art Day 2026 session powered by Access Holdings and Coronation Group in conversation with Osei Bonsu. We're looking at Nigerian modernism, the impact this exhibition has had from the moment it opened to this. Interestingly, this is a widely celebrated exhibition and is notably the biggest exhibition in Tate's 25-year history. So that's something that should make you, an employee of Access or Coronation, feel incredibly proud of. You represent an organization that has brought something so significant to life and continues to push on a global scale. Now, to further drive this context and so we understand truly what this means, we're going to have a live conversation delivered by the Senior Curator of International Arts, African and Diaspora, Osei Bonsu, whom we saw in the video. He's with us today. And the session will be led by Daniel Wallace, who is an arts expert and educator at Tate. Welcome, Osei, and welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's great to hear how proud you feel of watching that video, Natalie. Excellent. Now listen, just before I get into a conversation with Osei, we'll probably talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then we've got some opportunity for people that are watching to ask you questions, which I'll put to you. I just want to give a bit of context to World Art Day, because happy World Art Day, that's why we're here today. For people that don't know, World Art Day was set up by UNESCO. So that's the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. And what I feel is really interesting is that this year they've got a theme of a garden of expression, cultivating community through art. This idea of cultivating community. So World Art Day is about global creativity, artistic diversity, freedom of expression, bringing people together. And one of my definite observations of the Nigerian Modernism exhibition is how community is integral throughout it, not just sort of geographical communities of artists coming together and working together, communities of artists coming together at specific points in political and social moments in Nigerian history, but also this idea of those artists moving around communities and spreading both internally in Nigeria and then externally to the world, the work they're doing. So I was hoping I could start with putting to you this idea of the importance of community within what you've portrayed as the Nigerian modernism. And maybe you can speak a bit towards the different types of communities and how they maybe have come together at different points in time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. And I hope you can all hear me clearly. Yep.
We can, thank you.
You can. Okay, brilliant. So I would say that the idea of community is very important, not only in Nigeria, but in West Africa. And I would go as far as saying, of course, in the world. But I think why it becomes specifically important within the context of this exhibition is that the exhibition looks at the ways in which artists create community in large part through forms of patronage and artistic and cultural exchange. But I think in the first instance, particularly in the first room of the exhibition, where we're dealing with artists who would have been associated with the Lagos elite, art. So these are artists that would have had relationships with wealthy merchants, but also members of Christian missionary society who would have been Pan-Africanists or assimilationists, who were largely involved in the charge to drive Nigeria towards national independence, but all of whom had very different ideas around what the nation could be. And in the first room of the exhibition, in fact, you see works by artists like Akinola Lashikan and Justice Okorodelu, Aina Onobolu, who were fundamentally artists who relied on networks of patrons, communities of people who believed in the arts very early on. And that was pivotal. And it's something that I'm always reminding people, that you don't have to be wealthy to become a collector of art or come from a family who collects art. The first thing is just about getting to know artists, to see them as members of your community and supporting them directly or indirectly, whether it's visiting their exhibition. There are many examples of important Pan-Africanist leaders like Herbert Macaulay, who was involved in supporting artists very early on. And Nnamdi Azikiwe, of course, Nigeria's first president, who was really one of the first patrons to support Akinola Lashikan. So I think that's one of the ways in which community is reflected in the exhibition. And then another thing I would say becomes really important is this idea of artistic exchange. So in Zaria, in the town of Zaria in the 1950s and 60s, artists including Bruce Onobrakpeya, Demerson Woko, Uche Okeke, Yusuf Grillo, all of whom came from different ethnic, social and political backgrounds, came together to form the Zaria Art Society. And it was in response to the fact that they felt that the curriculum at their university was too European, although they were studying the first fine art diploma to be offered in Nigeria at the time. And those artists, in fact, pioneered a form of art known as natural synthesis, which had to do with bringing together aspects of European or foreign influence and indigenous African and Nigerian forms. And that act of synthesizing cultures, of bringing cultures together, was really a key to the way in which they innovated. And then another thing I would say in terms of community is this idea of non-skilled artists, or presumably non-skilled. So that means artists that don't have an academic training. So in the town of Oshogbo in the 60s, many artists gathered to form the Oshogbo School, often associated with Derulo Depot's Popular Bar and the Mbari Artists and Writers Club, or workshops. And many of those workshops really created community through knowledge exchange. And that's how artists began working with textile, printmaking, beadwork. Many of these forms deeply embedded within Yoruba society, and that were a huge part of, you could say, the cultural dynamism of the town of Oshogbo. But really, it was artists who helped create community to preserve those traditions and preserve the ideals of Orisha worship associated with the Oshun Oshogbo Grove and with the history of the town of Oshogbo. So there are so many things that we can be proud of within the exhibition, but I would say those are just some of the examples of where community features.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the things I want to bring in is I've been working at Tate for over 20 years, and
Yeah.
kind of connecting to what Ngozi said at the beginning, part of my role is to access art to everyone, to give people a chance to look at work and talk about it and make their own connections. And one of the things that I found fascinating about this, and I know a lot of the groups I've taken around as well, is it's not just about the artwork. It gives us a view of the diversity of Nigeria, of the different communities, of the history of it. Because a lot of people coming to the exhibitions aren't from Nigeria. I've taken a lot of Nigerians around though, but we have people from all around Europe visiting, all around the world coming to the gallery. And it's a chance to really experience the stories of Nigeria as well as those artists. And one thing I think it does so well is to reveal that. I think I heard you describe it as modernism not just being one thing, but kind of a multifaceted group of things that are you presenting in this exhibition.
Yeah.
I just wanted to talk briefly about that wider impact on the Tate collection. So if people don't know, Tate are the custodians of part of the National Collection of Art for the UK. And Tate Modern show the modern, international and contemporary art. And I think it's fair to say that when I started 23 years ago, when Tate Modern opened 25 years ago, a lot of that voice was kind of white men from Europe and North America. A lot of whom were dead. And there's actively that's been expanding over the years. So, for example, we have the African Acquisition Committee. I was hoping you could mention a bit about what the Acquisition Committee is and how this exhibition is going to diversify once the legacy of it, once it's over, into the media voice of Tate?
Yeah, of course. That's a brilliant question. So there are many works in the exhibition that are from Tate's collection. They include Bruce and Payer's Stations of the Cross and the Last Supper, Uzoa Obioro de Chukwu's Moon Ascending Between Us, Ellen Itsui's Solemn Crowds at Dawn, J.D. Ojekere's Hairstyle series from the 1970s. And all of those acquisitions really happened in the run up to the exhibition, in many ways to help bring more visibility and context to the contributions not only of Nigerian artists but of African artists. So I oversee the Africa Acquisition Committee, and one of the things that we're most proud of, I think, is the way in which the acquisitions that we've brought into the collection have really shifted the narrative of how we tell stories about art at Tate. But one of the challenges, as Daniel pointed out, is that this history was historically very Western, historically very male-dominated, of course. And what that means is that even though we're doing important work, there is still lots of work to be done, and that has to do not only with the representation of African art, but art from around the world, which is really at the center of what Tate is trying to do, which is to make international art accessible to the broadest possible public. And it's of course something that Daniel and his team play an important role in. So we really hope that this exhibition is just adding one narrative, one chapter to a much longer book, to a much longer history. And I would say that many of these artists, upon joining Tate's collection, become part of a transnational network. So one of the examples I like to use in the exhibition is the wall that's dedicated to artists associated with the Mbari Artists and Writers Club. So in the town of Ibadan in the 1960s, you had artists coming from South Asia, from Latin America, from Europe, to be part of the moment of independence just before the outbreak of the Civil War in 1966. And for those artists, Nigeria was really a space of optimism, of possibility, and a space of gathering where they could perhaps realize their artistic potential. And I think that it's incredible that we have so many works that can help tell those stories, but there are so many more stories to be told. And I would say that one of the things that I've noticed within this exhibition is that it's brought to light actually more histories and narratives that could be highlighted in future. So I always say that within each of these rooms in the exhibition, or maybe within each work, there is an entire universe to open up. And for those of you, of course, living in Nigeria who know about its ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity, that's something that you'll be very familiar with. But it's been something that's been a privilege to share with the audience just how diverse and how broad Nigerian identity really is. And that's why it could never have been an African modernism show, because even focusing on Nigeria was so broad, there were many things that we couldn't include. So I should just say that, yeah, there are more stories to be told.
Yeah, actually, I took round a Nigerian artist, a contemporary artist, and she was saying that she could see this as a stepping stone, how every room was just the inroad to something much bigger. And
Yeah.
for me, something that's incredibly exciting is this idea that some of the works I can talk about in the exhibition, when the exhibition closes, potentially will be in the collection and on display. And the way Tate lays out its collection, it's not chronologically, there's themes. So within a room, we may now have a theme where there's artists from across the world and across over 100 years of artwork, all integrating and interacting with each other to sort of show new dialogues and conversations.
Absolutely, that's the hope. And like you said, Tate's collection isn't chronological, and part of the reason why we chose to move away from that model is because often when we're thinking about art history, and it's been something I think that people have sometimes struggled to understand about Nigerian modernism, that modernism can mean something entirely different in a different geographic or cultural context. And when we assume that modernism is only, you could say, a kind of European phenomenon, it's not only a deeply exclusionary way of thinking about modernism, but it actually doesn't reflect the many contributions that artists have been making across history. And of course, not to speak of the ways in which European artists have been heavily inspired by African art for centuries. And I think that that's something that we wanted to bring to the fore, but also to speak about the importance of cultural exchange, that as early as the 1930s, you had Nigerian artists studying in the UK. You, of course, had an emergence of the kind of Commonwealth nations who became very much important in terms of cultural exchange between Britain and elsewhere. And all of those kind of geographic and geopolitical frameworks inform the development of art history. It's not just about thinking about artists in isolation, but seeing them as part of a much wider social movement.
And I think Tate and the legacy of this exhibition help really broaden that out.
Yeah.
But back to the sort of traditions within Nigeria.
Yeah.
When we're talking about all this multifaceted element of the work that's presented in the Nigerian modernism, we're talking about geographically,
Yeah.
culturally. What I'm interested in is how did you go about researching and tracking down some of these objects? Because I know when you're talking about an oral tradition, it must be
Mm.
quite hard to research and find some of the objects, some of the artworks that are on display for it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm often told that maybe the exhibition was easier for me because I was Ghanaian. So I am Ghanaian. I don't have let's say a kind of any skin in the game in terms of my association with a specific part of Nigeria. So I was able to travel fairly widely, although there are parts of Nigeria I still haven't had the privilege of visiting. It really centered around Lagos. That's where the research began because there were really important initiatives in Lagos like Art X, which Axis Bank and Coronation have played a key role in supporting. It's West Africa's only art fair as it stands, plays a very important role, but also festivals like the Lagos Biennale, which is due to happen in November of this year, were really important as spaces where I could meet artists and learn more about the various activities that were going on in Nigeria. And then, of course, you have many artists who are thankfully still with us and able to tell their stories, including Baba Bruce Onabrakpeya, Baba Demerson Woko, extraordinarily talented artists like Ndidi DK, who's based in Ikoyi in Lagos. You also have Ellen Etsui, who is based in the town of Nsukka and is now living in Ghana. And we were privileged to present his work as a Turbine Hall commission, one of the largest annual commissions for contemporary art in the world, in our Turbine Hall, supported by Hyundai. And I really think that those artists were really instrumental, almost as important as the traveling. And then another thing that was key within the research is looking at university collections in the US and in the UK, because as early as the 1940s, really in the post-war period, you had African artists who were exhibiting internationally, and some of them came to study at places like the University of Birmingham or York or Chichester, or historically black colleges in the US like Hampton University, Fisk University, who played a very important role in the narrative of the exhibition. So it was about thinking about the kind of the geographic context of Nigeria, but also the fact that many of these artists were working in a time in which it was common for them to travel internationally. So it was about kind of trying to map the various spaces that artists were working in, and to look at the histories of patronage as well. With someone like Ben Mwonwu, his work was actively collected in Europe and America, but it's partly because he received a scholarship to study in the UK in the 1940s and met with a network of influential artists and cultural figures. So yeah, there's a much longer story to tell, but I would say that it was really about opening up every possible door, and there are still many doors that have yet to be opened. So if any of you are interested in any of these artists or these collections, I'm happy to share a list of resources that you can access for your own research.
Yeah, I've got to say that unlike researching other exhibitions, for
Yeah.
me, it was quite hard because for some of the artwork, there isn't a written record
No.
of some of the background behind that artwork.
No.
And a lot of the ways into me talking about the artwork is about the community aspect of it
Yeah.
and how those artists had later impact. I'm
Yeah.
intrigued as well about this idea that a lot of the artists in the 40s, for example, were going abroad,
Yeah.
and that was maybe how their fame was increasing.
Yeah.
But I wondered if you could speak a bit around the point of independence and natural synthesis, and how more traditions became to be maybe embraced in the way
Yeah.
that work was presented internationally.
Yeah, absolutely. So the theory of natural synthesis was coined by Uche Okeke in around 1960. Well, actually on the eve of independence, so around 1957, 58. He, together with his cohorts, graduated in 1961, but they all went in very different directions. So Baba Demerson Woko went on to set up the New Cultural Studios in Ibadan. Uche Okeke set up the Esele Institute in Nimo. Bruce Onabrak set up the Harmattan workshops in Delta State. So they all went off and did different things. And I think one of the things that was really key in terms of thinking about the kind of movement of artists during this period was to sort of look at the ways in which they'd created systems for arts education which was one of the kind of backbones of the exhibition. Because around that question of community, I would say almost every influential artist in Nigeria during this period was also a scholar or an academic or a university professor. And I think it's frozen. I hope that you can hear. Yeah, it's fine.
Yes.
That there was a real emphasis on cultivating skills. And one of the things that's important to note during this period is the preservation of the royal guilds of Ife and the Benin kingdoms of the 16th and 17th century, which, even though dynastic art was no longer being made in the 20th century in Nigeria, you still had artists working in terracotta, bronze casting, traditional forms of carving that were a direct legacy of the kind of ancestral values associated with early dynastic forms. And one of the most important examples in the exhibition is the door of the Olowe of Ise in the first room of the exhibition. But I've lost train of thought slightly, but I think your question was around creating community, and I think art schools are a really important part of that story.
I think part of the question as well was this idea that at the point of independence, there's a different voice or a pressure maybe on artists to have a voice now that's going to represent what Nigerian art could be.
Yeah, that's true.
Outside of that,
But I would say that what emerges after independence isn't a unified nationalistic representation of art. So that's what some people are frustrated by, maybe in some ways, that Nigerian art never really develops a singular style or movement. If you think about the values of natural synthesis, it was about drawing as much on African and indigenous forms as it was on European art forms like Fauvism, Cubism, Post-Impressionism. And I think that the fundamental kind of push for those artists who were involved with the project of independence was to insist on the plurality of Nigerian cultural identity. So for an artist like Bruce Onabakpeye, who was raised Catholic to a Yoruba family, it was really important that when he created his depiction of the Stations of the Cross and the Last Supper, he acknowledged symbols associated with traditional Adire textiles as part of that. And controversially, when that work was unveiled in Lagos in the period of independence, despite the fact that many Nigerians by then were Christian, they rejected the commission, or the Christian mission church rejected the commission because of his use of African or Nigerian subjects in these biblical narratives. So that's a really interesting example of the ways in which artists found radical ways of combining ritual, spirituality, and sort of religious representation in ways that complicated the narrative of how Nigerian artists should be working or what they should be representing at that time. And another thing I would say is that many of those artists by the 1960s were insisting that students take field trips to parts of Nigeria like Jos in the northern part of the country to see some of the ancient terracottas. So there was this kind of re-embrace of indigenous cultures and systems and knowledge systems that was about overturning kind of colonial assumptions. But one of the things I think is important to note is that independence doesn't really change the artistic desire to create art. What it does is it galvanizes new forms of expression. And I think it's important that we also acknowledge the forms of art made during colonial rule, during the period of indirect rule, because they are just as valuable in the way that they speak about the role of artists within colonial society. And I think that that's something that this exhibition does that hasn't really been done before. Most people only address artists working after independence, which I think is a shame in a way, because there is a much broader story, and actually much of that resistance and sort of anti-colonial sentiment begins with the portraits of Aina Onabolu, who is working within this naturalistic style that advocates for the subjectivity of Nigerian elites.
We've only got a few minutes left of our chat before we go on to asking questions from the audience. But I was wondering, because I heard you say that you had the exhibition in mind for a few years before starting to galvanize it. And it took about 3 years to put it together. And I was wondering, really, why now? What came about now? And how did your sort of the support from Access Holdings and Coronation Group help bring all of that together?
Yeah, so I was fortunate to meet Mr. Aigboje Aigamokode at a party in Lagos I can't remember how long, 2 or 3 years ago, and I have built a friendship with his partner or four-way, who's a wonderful patron and advocate for the arts, as is Mr. Agboje's entire family, in fact. And I think that his commitment was really what led to the initial conversation, his interest in supporting this initiative. And then through that, we've seen just an extraordinary partnership that has blossomed during the period of the exhibition, but also in the run up to the exhibition. And I think that has to do with really a kind of a shared set of values and commitment to highlighting the best of Nigerian and African art on a global stage. But I would say that of course is an ongoing discussion, and I think that my excitement is that this exhibition has hopefully ignited a conversation around how Nigerian artists can be better highlighted within Nigeria, not least through exhibitions and opportunities to promote artists, but that may also lead to new scholarship, new research, because I think there's so much work that has yet to be done, and I'm hoping and I'm sure that Access and Coronation are going to play a leading role in that aspect.
Yeah, I guess the idea of all the lineage of all these artworks empowering contemporary artists to make work now.
Yeah, I often find artists who will say to me that they grew up in Lagos but never had a chance to see a Benin work, because it's only when these works are sold at auction that you see them, and by that time they're being sold to a private collector living somewhere in the world, perhaps in Nigeria or elsewhere. And I would just advocate for there being more Nigerian and African modern works on view to the public, and it's really important that as much as possible is done to highlight a kind of public awareness of the legacy of modern Nigerian art.
Mm. I mean, one of the things that specifically with this exhibition
Mm.
that's kind of been opened up was that Access Holdings and Coronation Group have made it free for school groups to come. So I've actually got some figures that I wanted to tell you that
Wow.
in March alone, 600 students and 73 teachers came for free to the exhibitions.
Wow.
And one thing that, I mean, schools come a lot to the gallery, but they don't often come to the pay exhibitions because the exhibitions like this have that wall, that barrier of having to pay for all your students to come in. So I think it's fantastic that that was opened up to them.
I mean, when I think of myself as a young student and what this exhibition would have meant to me, it's huge, and that can't be measured in a way. You can give the numbers, but it could inform, generations of artistic interest and passion, and could inspire a generation. So we're deeply appreciative for that support, and I think it's planting seeds for years to come.
Yes, and with it like spreading out into the main collection as well, it
Yep,
will always be there for people.
absolutely.
I was wondering, is there, maybe it's a silly question for a curator who's so connected to all the work, but are there highlights of the show for you, or highlights of the themes that you think have come out that you weren't expecting when you were initially set the exhibition up?
My highlights of the show are often the conversations that are prompted by various members of the public, and actually, indeed, by Tate's security team, who are very passionate about the exhibition, many of them being of Nigerian or West African heritage. And I would say
Yeah.
those moments are the most rewarding somehow, is when you see the impact that it's had on someone who never really considered an exhibition or a work of art to be something that they would be ordinarily interested in or inspired by. So I think it happens in all sorts of ways. I mean, at Tate, we're very lucky to constantly be surrounded by great art, but it's rare that there are so many works by artists of the continent on view in one place at one time. And that in and of itself is something that I'm very proud of. And another thing I would just say is that, historically, Nigeria hasn't, as in many contexts, highlighted female artists. And I think that the exhibition attempts to bring in more representation of artists who have been historically marginalized, like Ladi Kwali, the Nigerian potter and ceramicist, and Didi DK, the sculptor and installation artist, Mamanike Davis, the batik artist and textile designer. And those figures are really pivotal, and yet quite often when you see major books on not Nigerian art, their names aren't always represented in depth. So that's something that I'm especially proud of, is the attempt to address the historical imbalance, and the sort of historical invisibility of women artists, as just one example.
Mm. I mean, linking back to our initial start of this conversation about community, one thing I found fascinating about Mamanike was this idea that as a young artist, she supported other people in
Yeah,
finding ways to create work and sell it as a way to
yeah.
support themselves, and now has an institution that trains artists and
Yeah,
supports
and
art.
did that as a way of escaping an abusive marriage, and then went on to train other people, and specifically women, to treat textile design as a form of economic independence. And I think in terms of this idea of independence, one of the things that the exhibition insists on is that it's not just about advocating for political independence, but the idea that each of these artists holds an independent vision around how art can change society. And I think Mamanike's practice really embodies that, both as a kind of entrepreneur, as someone who owns a gallery in Lagos and Osogbo and in Abuja, and as a leading kind of force of nature within the Nigerian art sphere. And we've actually created a video for the Tate website, and it's available on YouTube, dedicated to Mamanike, that you can watch after this. We're happy to disseminate a link, but it's really inspiring, where she's talking about her life and career.
Yeah, I mean, an example of an artist where they taken out of any context what she's done,
Mm,
doesn't matter where she was in the world, is
mm.
amazing and
Yeah.
inspirational.
Yep, absolutely. And that sense of inspiration is there in many of the practices in the exhibition. One of the last artists to be displayed is an artist named Uzo Ogonu, who arrived in the UK in the 1940s, in 1945, in fact, just after the end of the Second World War. And Uzo Ogonu went on to become part of the Black British art movement, but wasn't really understood within Britain, because he was viewed as a Nigerian artist, and yet in Nigeria he was viewed as a British artist. And I think that speaks to some of the contradictions around migration and diaspora that would emerge later in the century. And what Uzo Ogonu did, particularly through his series Stateless People, is to sort of capture the way, as I mentioned in the video, that Nigerians around the world were becoming part of this global diaspora, but also that he was kind of championing this notion that artists had to kind of find a way to advocate for the values of independence, even though the fact that by then Nigeria was going through a difficult time politically, and he felt that he could no longer return to Nigeria. So he was sort of navigating the contradictions of belonging to a nation and yet not always feeling part of that nation. And I think that's something that many people can relate to, irrespective of where in the world that they're from. And it's why we wanted it to be the final room of the exhibition, that it felt a very powerful narrative to impart.
Yeah, fantastic. What I'd like to do now is open up the questions to people watching. We've
Yeah.
already got one come through. So we've been asked by Joe, were there any standout works of artists you want to include but couldn't due to availability or conservation issues?
Yeah, there is the reason the Benenwonwu room is so dense is because we really struggled to convince some collectors to lend to the exhibition. And I think that one of the things that became very apparent is that because many Nigerian collectors had not necessarily worked with public institutions before, or I should say collectors of Nigerian art, some of them were quite skeptical as to whether the exhibition would be worth their
Mm,
time or energy. Not all, but some, and I think some may now live to regret it. But it meant that we were chasing loans up until the very end, and that's quite rare for a Tate exhibition, because you typically we would have a kind of set checklist and things would be much more secure. But because of the number of private loans, that wasn't really an option. So I think that there are works that we didn't end up including. I'm trying to think of one that comes to mind. There's an extraordinary no, actually, we got that work in the end. I would say no. Almost every work that we really wanted to ensure was represented is represented. I would just say that in so many ways, I'm sort of mindful that there are missing links, and there are artists who worked well through the 20th century whose works were not necessarily seen as commercially valuable. So as such, collectors didn't really preserve their works, and museums didn't really collect them very widely. So Aina Onabolu is a very good example. There is one example of Aina Onabolu's work in the US collection. It's Sisi Nurse, which is from 1922. And then there are other works in the collection of Prince Yemisi Shillon just outside of Lagos. But beyond that, it's very difficult to find early 20th century works by Nigerian artists. So I'm hoping that the exhibition will help unearth more examples and maybe encourage people to look again at works that may well be hidden masterpieces, hidden in plain sight. So yeah, I think there probably are works, but certainly the exhibition tried to be as comprehensive as possible in terms of its representation.
Yeah, I like the idea that there are some collectors out there kicking themselves for missing out on such a big show.
Yeah.
Osse has asked, what would you say to someone who is trying to build an interest in art? What do I need to know to make it easy for me?
Yeah, I would say start with coffee table books. That's a great way in. So you can buy them from your local bookshop or online, and they're kind of a great overview. So if you're interested in modern Nigerian art, there's a great book called Nigerian Artists, published. I think it's published by an Italian imprint. It's called Artists of Nigeria, and it has maybe 300 artists in it, some of which are in the exhibition. Our catalogue is available to purchase, and I'm happy to send a copy to the bank if you haven't already received them. I'm sure your colleagues can help point you in the right direction, which covers many of the works included in the exhibition and some important scholarly insights. And there is so much great literature online. There's an online platform called Contemporary which focuses on sort of writing about contemporary African art. And then if you're going to dig a little bit deeper, there's a great journal called NKA, NKA, which is, I think it's an Igbo word, but don't quote me on that. And that's published out of Cornell University, and they're known for publishing academic texts on Nigerian art. So that's one aspect. Go to ArtX. If you're in Lagos or if you're in London, go to 154 Art Fair, and just look at art in a fair environment. And then, of course, just visit museums and galleries as often as you can. In Lagos, there are some great galleries like Ko, which is in Ikoyi. You also have, God, I don't want to play favorites, many great galleries in Lagos that you can visit. And then finally, I would say, especially if you're interested in collecting art, really important to get to know artists and support them in any way that you can. So there are lots of young and emerging artists in Lagos that would really benefit from the support that potential collectors or patrons could bring. So visiting their studios, following them on social media, etc. Those are just one of many ways that you can support Nigerian art.
I think you've partly answered the next question from Daniel, which was, as employees of Axis and Coronation, how can we in our personal capacities push art, especially Nigerian art, in such a way that aligns naturally with our organisation's commitment to advancing African art on the global scale?
I just think being present is really important. And I think in our attention divided economy, it's getting harder and harder. So I think making time on the weekend to take your family to galleries is a really important thing. I'm actually going to share the initiative, but there was an initiative launched in Lagos, I believe, last year, which is a kind of gallery weekend. And I can't remember the time of year that it takes place, but you get a map of all of the galleries around town, and you can go and visit them as part of this kind of festival. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of other initiatives. Of course, the National Theatre has just reopened, and it's extraordinary that now that the National Theatre is reopened, you can go and see examples of historic works by Lamidi Fakai, Yusuf Grillo, available to the public. And alongside that, you have the National Gallery and the National Museum. But I know that they're not always accessible to the public. But I think you can book to visit those spaces, and certainly they're always eager to have support from members of the community. So I think those would be good examples. And then finally, the Yemisi Shillon Museum, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours outside of Lagos, but I think a pivotal museum at the Pan African University. Prince Yemisi Shillon is probably the longest standing sort of collector of many forms of Nigerian art. But I think that museum has extraordinary exhibitions and is available to visit. I think most of the year. So that would be my top choice, actually. Visit Yemisi Shillon Museum at the Pan African University.
Another question from Joe, which was, with the exhibition layout, how did you decide on the 9-room structure and the thematic flow?
Yeah. Most exhibitions, it's a bit like putting together an album or whatever sort of other medium that you can think of. You're trying to think about ways of telling a story that might not necessarily be linear, but where there is a kind of coherent movement from one zone or from one space to the next. So that in that process, what you often find is that there will be larger spaces that will necessitate larger artworks, and then there are more intimate spaces where the opposite may be true. But you also have instances where you want to have kind of a rhythm in an exhibition. So the exhibition opens really with a kind of constellation of works, but it's quite a traditional hang. It's quite kind of modular, and there's a vitrine at the center, and then there's the large relief in the background, and then there is this kind of explosion of works in the next room that speaks to the fact that Benin trained really as a Royal Academician and saw himself within that tradition of picture galleries, and picture galleries famously will have artworks going all the way up to the ceiling. So it was important to kind of honor that methodology. And then as you go into the Zaria room, there's still a kind of constellational way of hanging, but it's much more asymmetric, and that has to do with graduate exhibitions and the way exhibitions are often shown at university contexts, where you have artists putting works up in a very kind of free way. So that was a way of honoring that. So I believe, that there are lots of creative ways that you can tell stories through exhibitions. It doesn't have to be so exacting or formal. And that was the way that we realized it. And the story is roughly chronological, but it looks more at a kind of discrete networks of artists across the span of the 20th century.
Yeah, I think when I was taking people through it, it definitely led itself to a chronological flow that allowed us to talk about the impact of Western teaching and
Mm,
artists going out into the West, and then
mm,
a more embracing of traditions as we
mm,
went through. Um, and then also just talking about what happened in Nigeria over time to go
mm.
alongside that, and
Yeah,
seeing how the artists responding to what socially and politically is happening. So it felt
yeah.
like, for someone that doesn't know a lot about Nigerian history,
Mm.
doesn't know a lot about Nigerian art, it conducively lets you explore both at the same time.
Yeah, and I should also say that Nigerian history is so complex and rightly multi-layered that it wasn't trying to necessarily tell a kind of social narrative of Nigerian art, but to really allow the art to speak for itself in certain instances. So whether it be Benin Wonwu's Biafra painting, or Storm over Biafra, or Demerson Woko's Nigeria in 1959, there are moments where artists are making these very strong political statements, but they're doing it alongside the quotidian and the everyday, and the exhibition sort of holds both of those things side by side, rather than kind of isolating the political history as being the kind of foremost way in which artists are engaging with their surroundings.
And we had another comment, which was, it was very insightful, but it would be
Mm.
lovely to have some Ghanaian artists and art galleries highlighted, especially having an entity in Ghana.
Yeah.
Ghanaian art. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are several Ghanaian artists in the show, and it wasn't deliberate. BC Fabunmi came to the town of Osogbo I think, in his early adulthood or late teens, not to join, but he ended up joining the theatre group of Dura Ladipo. But he was born in the town of Takrade, which is where Ellen Etsui is from. Ellen Etsui, who studied at Kwame Nkrumah University in Kumasi, then went on to become a teacher, a professor at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, in the 1970s. And he came to Nigeria in the 70s after the Civil War because he felt that Nkrumah's notion of Pan-Africanism was more present within Nigeria, as was more alive than it was in Ghana, which is really fascinating because it's almost kind of, a kind of direct, challenge, you could say, to this idea that that people associate kind of Nkrumah's legacy specifically with kind of nationalism in Ghana, but actually Ellen Itsui felt that Nigerians had done more to embody that call to independence. So even though Ghana achieved its independence before Nigeria in 1957, so it's just interesting. And then I think that in terms of Ghanaian galleries and things going on, I probably will eventually do an exhibition to address modern art in Ghana, but it's not for me just to regurgitate the same structure. I would be really interested to see how a Ghanaian curator living in Ghana may take aspects of Ghanaian history and create a narrative. There hasn't really been much scholarship on modern Ghanaian art. So I'd like to see more in that department. We are doing a display which opens in a few months on the Triangle Art Network, and that will include works by the Ghanaian artist Atta Kwame. And if you're interested in modern art in Ghana, there's an incredible book called Kumasi Realism, that you can find in bookstores and online. And it's a story of modern art in Ghana from the perspective of sign painting, which was one of the first art forms to become popularized in Ghana, and maybe was one of the first art forms that really allowed artists to experiment with painting traditions. So it's really interesting to think about the kind of informality of some of these artistic movements, and it doesn't always have to happen in a university. Sometimes artists can innovate on the street and in their local environment, and that's something that the Oshogbo movement certainly demonstrates.
Fantastic. I think that was a great way to end, Osai. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for Access Group and Coronation for inviting us along for today. It was brilliant. I think Natalie's going to join back in with us.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you so much, Daniel and Osei. This has been a really insightful conversation. It's been amazing. I would like to think that many people took learnings and they noted new things that they probably didn't even know about Nigerian art. And I mean, you can see the audience; they're responding. So receive your virtual flowers and the applause. So I would also like to use this opportunity to inform the audience that we would like to take reflections. So if you would love to share your thoughts, just reflect on all that has happened, from when we started this session all the way to this point. You can indicate by raising your hand and you'll be allowed to speak. It will be nice to hear from you, our employees, across Access Holdings and Coronation ecosystem. Just let us know how you feel, things you have taken out of this session. It's been a very rich conversation, very much anchored in culture. You see the contributions of Nigerian art, and we're looking at things that have been created pre-independence Nigeria, even to the point of post-independence Nigeria. So it's very significant. And so if you would love to share reflections or perhaps even have any additional questions that you would like say to answer, this will be a very good time to do that. So raise your hand and we'll welcome you to the stage. I'd also like to make this announcement to Coronation employees that we will be rolling out a quiz. It's part of the activities to commemorate World Art Day. And so we're looking at 35 questions covering the Nigerian Modernism exhibition, uh, Coronation Art Gallery, essentially our involvement with art. So all the things we do beyond partnerships with cultural institutions like Tate. Those are the questions, and of course, general questions around art. So be on the lookout. We'll be sending this via internal comms. So here are 3 rules that you need to know. Only the top 10 participants with the highest scores and fastest submissions will win the prizes. So note that speed and accuracy are key. Every second counts. And in the event of a tie, the fastest submission will take the lead. So the moment you receive the email from internal comms, click on the link and begin to answer the questions. And one final thing to note on the quiz is that it ends by 3 p.m. So if your responses come any later than 3 o'clock today, you would not be recorded as a potential winner for the quiz. It's really exciting. I once again love to thank Daniel and Jose for taking us through this conversation. Personally, I found it helpful. I remember taking, art classes in secondary school and learning about Benin. One artwork I would never forget of his is the Anyanwu sculpture. And, I remember looking at that, seeing it in textbooks. And when I had an opportunity to actually see it in real life, that was, a moment that deeply resonated with me. And I'm sure many people across the session today would have, personal anecdotes that connects them to all that's being done in work regarding Nigerian modernism. Okay, and so to take us to the closing, I'd love to invite the Chief Brand and Communications Officer, Access Holdings, Amici Okobi, who will address us and deliver the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you. First of all, happy World Art Day to all of us on here. And I especially want to thank Jose and Daniel. Hearing you two speak about art and with the passion and the energy with which you did is truly appreciated. When we think about art, a lot of us, and from the questions I saw, it could be intimidating, it could be unwelcoming, it could be something that's not for us. But the way you engaged, and of course Bilal as well, the way you engaged and shared the importance of art just lets us know that in art, everyone can actually come in and be involved. When we think about what Access and Coronation has done, it talks to the fact that art is indeed for everyone, and we are so much more than just finance. We're about creating platforms that foster creativity, drive thought and conversation, essentially give you something to be proud of. So hats off to Coronation, hats off to Access, even though I'm not part of the organization, but salute. You, employees of Access and Coronation, you should be proud. We are telling the Nigerian and by extension, African story in a way that resonates. I think it was Ngozi or Osei that said that in the 25 years of Tate, this was one of the largest opening events for any exhibition. And it's about Nigerian and African art. That's something that is worthy of note and something that you should take with you. So the collaboration is just the beginning of many, many things that we'll do together. We share the conviction that Nigerian modernism isn't just a closed chapter in our history. It's a living, evolving narrative. And we all need to think about what we can do to keep telling those stories. As we go through life, it's stories that drive our legacy, stories that tell our history, stories that will essentially build our heritage. So let's keep doing that. I know each and every one of us in here, particularly Coronation and Access employees, if you look around you, there's art all around you. I know in Access, on all our floors, we have a veritable gallery, but at Coronation, you have an amazing gallery on the ground floor. Today is World Art Day. Let's take a photograph. Let's talk about art. Let's talk about this session. It starts with you and I. The way to support artists, to support Nigerian art, to support African art, is to drive the conversation that supports this. So take a photograph, share a photograph, let people know. Osei said a lot about how you can get involved in art. And I do encourage us to do the same. Take your families, go to galleries, buy the coffee books. Let's start to make art much more accessible than it is, because it really is. And it's not about collectors or galleries or major exhibitions. Anybody can support art. Anybody can love art. Anybody can be a part of the art world. And I definitely do thank Jose and Daniel for the conversation you had and the way you made it accessible. So as we close, let me just ask, tell these stories. What have you learned today? What can you share today? Get on your social, let the world know. Today is World Art Day. And as Nigerians and Africans, as far as Tate is concerned, this very day we're leading the pack. So Osei, Bilal, wherever you are, Daniel, thank you, thank you, thank you. And to all my colleagues who are now art lovers, I thank you all for being here and being a part of this incredible conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amici. That was very thought-provoking. And as we close, I just want to remind you all, just as Amici has said, know that this is a conversation that will continue. Nigerian modernism will continue to live on and continue to shape conversations. Also, be reminded that Nigerian art really is not only rich in history, but will continue to shape all conversations in very meaningful ways. Just as a reminder again to Coronation employees, please be on the lookout for the email from Internal Comms and begin to participate in our trees. And lastly, to Osei, you had earlier mentioned, sharing a list of resources with us so we can, for further study, would really appreciate that. So if you can get that through to us, we'll cascade to employees in our ecosystem, and we can take that for further study. So thank you again, everyone, for being such good participants. This has been a wonderful session. Go to the gallery, take pictures, talk about today. It's World Art Day. Let's celebrate World Art Day. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.